the band of tension at the base of the skull, the rigid, aching strip that runs from behind one ear to the other, the one that tightens after an hour of reading, after a day at a screen, after years of looking down at a world built below eye level, the tension that massage loosens for a day before it returns, the tension that stretching cannot reach because the muscles generating it lie too deep beneath the upper trapezius for any surface technique to access. Those muscles sit directly above a passage that connects your brainstem to every major organ in your torso, and every hour of that tension compresses it. What that compression does to your heart rate, your digestion, and your immune system is where the physics leads next. That tension is a group of 4 small muscles, each one shorter than your index finger, sustaining a load they were never designed to hold continuously. The head weighs approximately 5 kilograms when balanced directly above the spine in neutral position. 5 kilograms is not a significant load. A bag of flour, a small watermelon. The cervical spine manages it effortlessly when the weight sits directly above the support structure, the way a column supports a sphere placed at its center. Head has drifted forward, the typical screen posture, whether the screen is a computer monitor, a tablet, a phone, or a book, positions the head approximately 5 to 7 centimeters ahead of the spine. The weight has not changed, still the head's resting mass. But the physics has changed entirely because the weight is no longer balanced above the support. It is cantilevered ahead of it, the way a wrecking ball extends from its crane arm. The torque equation governs what happens next, force multiplied by distance. The force is the head's mass pulling downward through gravity. The distance is the horizontal gap between the head's center of mass and the spine's support point. Cervical spine loading from forward head posture was calculated by Hans Raj in Surgical Technology International. At 15 degrees of forward flexion, the effective load on the cervical structures reaches approximately 12 kilograms. At 30 degrees, a moderate reading angle, 18 kilograms. At 30 degrees, a moderate reading angle. At 45 degrees, the angle of looking down at a phone held at waist level, 22 kilograms. At 60 degrees, 27 kilograms. The neutral load generating 27 kilograms of effective load through nothing more than a lever arm and gravity. Physics is identical to holding a weight at different distances from your body. Hold a dumbbell equal to the head's resting mass against your chest, and it feels like the head's resting mass. Hold it at arm's length in front of you, and the same weight feels like it has tripled. Your shoulder muscles must generate far more force to support the weight against the longer lever arm. The cervical spine is the shoulder in this analogy. The head is the dumbbell. Forward head posture is the arm extending further and further from the body. The muscles at the back of the neck are the shoulder muscles straining to hold a weight that has not gotten heavier, but has gotten further from the support point. The load your neck carries during screen posture is the load your arms would carry holding a bowling ball in front of you at chest height. Your arms would fatigue within minutes. Your suboccipital muscles carry this load for hours because the posture persists and the muscles have no option to set the weight down. Muscles absorbing this load are the suboccipital group, 4 paired muscles connecting the skull base to the first 2 vertebrae of the cervical spine. Rectus capitis posterior, major and minor. Obliquus capitis superior and inferior. These are small, deep muscles designed for a specific purpose, fine rotational adjustments of the head, the micro movements that keep your eyes level as your body shifts, the subtle tilts that orient your gaze during conversation. They are precision instruments. Under forward head posture, they become structural beams, locked in continuous isometric contraction to prevent the head from dropping further forward under the multiplied gravitational load. Isometric contraction, muscles generating force without changing length, holding position against a load rather than moving through a range, produces a specific physiological consequence when sustained beyond approximately 30 seconds. The contracted muscle fibers compress the capillaries running through the muscle tissue. Blood flow through the muscle drops. Oxygen delivery decreases. Metabolic waste. Lactate, hydrogen ions, potassium accumulates because the reduced blood flow cannot clear it at the rate the working muscle produces it. Ergonomics research established the threshold decades ago. Sustained isometric contraction above 15% of a muscle's maximum voluntary capacity reduces blood flow enough to produce ischemia, insufficient oxygen delivery to meet the tissue's metabolic demand. The suboccipital muscles under forward head posture are contracting at far above 15% of their maximum. They are contracting at levels typically associated with maximal effort because the torque load from the cantilevered head demands it. Posture never changes because the world you inhabit is built below eye level. Screens sit on desks designed for writing, not for viewing. Books rest on laps, phones are held at chest height, cooking surfaces sit at waist level, and car dashboards are positioned below the windshield. Every focal point of modern daily life sits below the horizontal eye line, and every glance downward adds degrees to the cervical flexion angle, and every degree adds kilograms to the effective load the suboccipital muscles must sustain. 8 hours of screen work, the monitor positioned below the natural eye line because the desk was designed for writing with a pen, not viewing a screen at eye level. 2 hours of phone use, the device held at chest or lap height, the neck flexing 30 to 45 degrees to bring the eyes to the screen. 1 hour of reading, the book or tablet resting on the lap or table. 1 hour of food preparation, the cutting board and stovetop positioned at waist height, the neck flexing to watch the hands work. 30 minutes of eating, the plate on the table, the head dropping forward with each bite. 12.5 hours of sustained forward head loading, producing that entire duration of suboccipital contraction, ischemia, and compressive force on the jugular foramen and the structures passing through it. The remaining 11.5 hours include sleep, during which the pillow height and sleep position determine whether the cervical spine finally achieves neutral or maintains a modified forward flexion throughout the night. Ischemia is self-perpetuating. The contracted muscles need blood flow to clear the accumulated waste. The blood flow is blocked by the contraction. The waste accumulation triggers pain receptors, nociceptors embedded in the muscle tissue that detect the acidic environment of ischemic metabolism. The pain triggers a protective response, further muscle tightening, guarding against the perceived threat. The tightening increases the compression. The compression reduces the blood flow further. The waste accumulates faster. The pain intensifies. The cycle runs continuously, held in place by the gravitational load that never releases because the head never returns to neutral for long enough to break the contraction ischemia pain loop. The tension transmits through the cervical fascia to adjacent structures, the temporalis muscle above, the masseter muscle at the jaw angle. The nighttime teeth grinding you attribute to stress may be the suboccipital tension transmitting through fascial connections to the jaw muscles. The clenching is mechanical, a downstream mechanical consequence of upstream cervical compression. Torque, load, and ischemia cycle explain the tension you feel. The tension is the symptom. The problem is what the sustained contraction does to the structure passing beneath those muscles. Beneath those muscles, passing through the narrow space between the locked suboccipital group and the bony skull base, runs a structure the tension is compressing with every hour of forward posture. A nerve exits the skull through a bony canal at the base of the cranium, a passage called the jugular foramen, shared with 2 other cranial nerves and the internal jugular vein. The foramen is a fixed opening in bone, approximately 12 millimeters in its longest diameter in the average adult skull. It does not widen. It cannot expand to accommodate swelling or hypertrophy in the surrounding tissue. When the muscles surrounding it hypertrophy from years of sustained loading, when they lock in sustained contraction and swell with the fluid retention that chronic ischemia produces, the soft tissue structures passing through and adjacent to the foramen receive compressive force from outside. Nerve passing through that compressed passage is the vagus cranial nerve 10, the longest nerve in the autonomic nervous system, running from the brain stem to the heart, the lungs, the stomach, the intestines, the spleen, the liver. The nerve, the humming discussion described activating through recurrent laryngeal branch vibration. The nerve, the gargling discussion described stimulating through pharyngeal contraction. Both techniques activate branches of the vagus that exit the nerve trunk below the skull base, below the compression site. The stimulation reaches the branches. The main trunk carrying the signal to and from the brainstem passes through the compressed foramen. And what happens when that trunk signal degrades changes how every organ below the skull functions. Neology is a highway with multiple on-ramps feeding into a main trunk that narrows to a single lane at a choke point near its destination. Humming activates one on-ramp, the recurrent laryngeal branch in the chest. Gargling activates another, the pharyngeal branch in the throat. Slow breathing activates a third, the pulmonary branches in the lungs. Each on-ramp feeds vagal afferent signals onto the main trunk. But the main trunk narrows at the jugular foramen, the single-lane choke point at the skull base. The signals generated by humming, gargling, and breathing all converge onto a trunk that passes through the compressed passage. The activation techniques are not failing. They are generating signals that arrive at a bottleneck, and the bottleneck reduces the signal that reaches the brainstem regardless of how much signal the branches generate below it. Releasing the bottleneck does not replace the activation techniques. It allows them to deliver their full signal to the destination. But the vagus nerve is not primarily a command nerve sending instructions downward from the brain to the organs. 80% of the fibers in the vagus nerve are afferent sensory fibers carrying information upward from the organs to the brainstem. The gut reports its motility status, its inflammatory state, its microbial environment. The heart reports its rhythm, its pressure, its contractile state. The immune system reports its activation level through vagal afferents from the spleen and liver. The brainstem receives this continuous data stream, the body's internal status report, through the vagus nerve trunk that passes through the jugular foramen. Compression at the foramen does not merely reduce the commands going down to the organs. It reduces the information coming up from the organs to the brain. The brain loses its interoceptive data stream, the continuous sensory input that allows the central nervous system to monitor and regulate the body's internal state. The brainstem that should be receiving detailed reports from every major organ instead receives a degraded signal, attenuated, delayed, incomplete. The regulatory decisions the brainstem makes based on this signal, heart rate adjustment, digestive secretion timing, immune surveillance calibration, inflammatory response modulation, are made with insufficient data. Suboccipital muscle compression affects the cervical neurovascular structures passing through the region, as Bove and Chappell identified in manual therapy, including the vertebral artery, the suboccipital nerve, and the structures at the jugular foramen. The anatomy places the nerve inside the passage. The physics places 12 to 27 kilograms of sustained compression on that passage, depending on the degree of forward displacement. The degree to which that compression reduces the vagal signal has not been directly measured in a controlled trial. The evidence calibration requires stating this explicitly. But the anatomy and the load leave little mechanical ambiguity about the direction of the effect. A nerve passing through a passage surrounded by muscles under sustained maximal contraction is a nerve experiencing compressive force. Nerve conduction studies in peripheral nerves demonstrate measurable signal velocity reduction under far less compressive load than the suboccipital muscles generate during forward head posture. The question is not whether compression occurs, it is how much signal degradation the compression produces, and the clinical correlates suggest the degradation is significant. Well, the clinical consequences map precisely to the organs the vagus nerve regulates, because each organ loses the regulatory signal it depends on. Reduced vagal tone, measured clinically as reduced heart rate variability, the variation in time between successive heartbeats, produces a specific constellation of effects. Heart rate variability as a measure of vagal function was quantified by Thayer and colleagues in Neuroscience and Biobehavioral Reviews, establishing that higher HRV reflects stronger vagal braking on the sympathetic nervous system, while lower HRV reflects sympathetic dominance from reduced vagal input. Autonomic nervous system operates through continuous opposition. The sympathetic branch accelerates, raising heart rate, diverting blood from digestion to skeletal muscles, suppressing immune surveillance, elevating cortisol, preparing the body for physical threat. The parasympathetic branch, carried predominantly by the vagus, decelerates, slowing heart rate, activating digestive motility, enabling immune function, reducing cortisol, facilitating the physiological state required for sleep onset and tissue repair. Sleep onset depends on a specific autonomic transition. The parasympathetic shift that slows the heart, deepens the breath, reduces cortisol, and signals every organ that the active phase is ending and the restorative phase is beginning. The vagus nerve initiates this transition. The shift from sympathetic to parasympathetic dominance at bedtime is not a switch that flips. It is a gradual handover, the vagal brake increasing its force over 30 to 60 minutes, while sympathetic output decreases in parallel. Disrupted vagal tone delays this handover. The person lies in bed, often with a pillow stack that maintains a mild cervical flexion because the shortened fascia has tightened the anterior neck tissue to the point where lying flat feels uncomfortable without head elevation. The pillow compensates for the shortened fascia. Sleep, maintain a reduced but persistent contraction against the pillow's angle. The nerve that should be decompressing during recumbency remains partially compressed. The heart rate that should be descending through the 50s hovers in the 70s. The cortisol that should be at its daily nadir remains elevated. The body is in bed. The room is dark. The temperature is cool. Every external condition for sleep is met, but the autonomic state is still the state of midday alertness, because the vagal brake that should be slowing the entire system into its restorative mode is weakened at the skull base by the same postural load that built during the 16 hours of forward head activity that preceded the attempt to sleep. The two branches do not alternate. They operate simultaneously, with the balance between them determining the body's functional state at any given moment. The vagus is the brake, the sympathetic system is the accelerator, and both are always engaged. The balance point determines whether the body rests or fights. Vagal compression shifts the balance point towards sympathetic dominance, not by increasing sympathetic activity, but by reducing the braking force that restrains it. The sympathetic system does not need to change. The vagal brake weakens. The same sympathetic output that was held in check by strong vagal tone now runs without adequate opposition. Resting heart rate rises from 62 to 74 beats per minute over a period of years, a shift you attribute to aging or cardiovascular deconditioning rather than to a compressed nerve. The change is visible on any fitness tracker or smartwatch that records resting heart rate over time. The graph shows a gradual upward trend. A beat per minute here, 2 beats there, the line climbing so slowly it never triggers alarm, but never returning to the baseline you remember from 5 years ago. The cardiologist finds no structural abnormality. The ECG is normal, the heart is healthy. The nerve that should be slowing it is compressed at a site no cardiac workup examines, because the compression is in the neck, not the chest, and the symptom presents at the organ the nerve regulates rather than at the site where the nerve is impaired. Digestive motility slows, and the slowdown is measurable in the time between eating and the sensation of the meal having moved through. The vagus nerve controls the migrating motor complex, the coordinated wave of muscular contractions that moves food through the stomach and small intestine in approximately 4 to 5 hours in a healthy system. Reduced vagal tone slows this complex. The stomach retains food longer. The small intestine processes more sluggishly. You experience the consequences bloating that persists hours after a meal, as a sensation of fullness disproportionate to the portion consumed, as discomfort you attribute to food sensitivity or dietary indiscretion. The gastroenterologist finds no pathology. The endoscopy is normal. The tissue is healthy. The nerve that coordinates the tissue's movement is compressed at a site no gastrointestinal workup examines. Immune surveillance decreases. The cholinergic anti-inflammatory pathway mediated by vagal efferents to the spleen becomes less active, and the low-grade systemic inflammation you accept as a consequence of aging may be partly a consequence of a weakened vagal brake on the immune system's inflammatory response. Pressing 2 tennis balls against the base of my skull that afternoon, positioned at the suboccipital ridge with a gap between the balls straddling the spine, and held the position for 90 seconds, the release was not what I expected. The ache did not merely decrease. The muscles that had been locked in sustained contraction for what I now understood was years began releasing in a sequence I could feel, a spreading warmth as blood rushed back into tissue that had been ischemic for what I now calculated was approximately 14 hours, the entire previous day of screen work, reading, cooking, and driving, followed by a night on a pillow that maintained the flexion. 14 hours of sustained compression released in under 2 minutes. The warmth was reactive hyperemia, the blood surge mechanism familiar from peripheral vessels, now occurring in the deepest cervical muscles, a softening of the rigid band. The sensation was similar to removing a tight collar you had forgotten you were wearing. The restriction had become so habitual that its presence was invisible until its absence revealed it. And underneath the muscular release, something I had not anticipated, a change in breathing. The breath deepened without conscious effort, the exhale lengthened. The heart rate, I was wearing a monitor, dropped 4 beats per minute within 3 minutes of the release. The vagal brake that had been mechanically weakened by the compression was strengthening as the compression lifted. The heart rate variability, which I had been tracking on a chest strap monitor, showed the shift numerically. The RMSSD value, a standard measure of vagal tone, increased from 31 milliseconds before the release to 44 milliseconds 15 minutes after, a 42% increase in vagal tone from the sustained pressure on the suboccipital muscles. The nerve was compressed, mechanically, by muscles responding to a load the torque equation imposed, and the compression was reversible. The signal pathway was intact, the bottleneck was structural. Remove the structure's sustained contraction and the signal returns to its full capacity. Body adapts to sustained posture through a process the tissue itself drives. The cervical fascia, the connective tissue wrapping every muscle, nerve, vessel, and bone in the neck, responds to sustained mechanical loading by laying down additional collagen fibers along the lines of habitual stress. The process is the same physics that produces calluses on a laborer's hands or thickened soles on a barefoot runner's feet. Tissue remodeling in response to chronic mechanical demand. Over decades of forward head posture, the anterior cervical fascia, the connective tissue on the front of the neck, shortens. The posterior fascia thickens and stiffens. The sternocleidomastoid muscles develop fibrotic adhesions. The scalene muscles tighten into their shortened position. Tissue locks around the forward position like a straitjacket, and the straitjacket tightens with age. Collagen cross-linking accelerates after 50. Sugar molecules in the blood bond permanently to collagen fibers, a process called glycation, and the bonds accumulate with age, stiffening the tissue further with each passing year. The fascia that remodeled around the forward position at 40 was still somewhat pliable. The collagen fibers, though oriented along the habitual loading direction, retained enough elasticity to allow temporary correction. The fascia at 65 has undergone additional cross-linking that reduces its pliability further. The straitjacket that could be stretched at 40 has stiffened into a rigid frame at 65. The correction that was difficult but possible 2 decades ago may be structurally impossible without mechanical tissue release. The fascia will not lengthen through stretching alone because the cross-linked collagen fibers resist elongation beyond a threshold that conscious muscle contraction cannot exceed. Conscious postural correction, the decision to stand up straight, to pull the shoulders back, to retract the chin, requires fighting the tissue's remodeled resting length. You pull your head back and the shortened anterior fascia resists while the stiffened posterior fascia pulls forward. The corrected posture holds for minutes, sometimes seconds, before the elastic recoil of remodeled tissue pulls the head forward again. You are fighting structural tissue that has physically adapted to the wrong position across 20 or 30 years of daily reinforcement. Now, why the tissue adapted, and why it tightens further after 50, involves a molecular change most people have never heard of. And then, the deep cervical flexors compound the problem, because the muscles that should prevent the forward drift are atrophying while the muscles causing the compression are strengthening. The longus colli and longus capitis, deep muscles running along the front of the cervical spine, are designed to hold the head in neutral position through low-level tonic contraction. They are the postural muscles. Under forward head posture, the suboccipital muscles take over their role at massively higher force levels. The deep flexors, no longer needed for the task they were designed for, atrophy from disuse. The muscle group that should be holding the head in neutral weakens, while the muscle group that should not be holding the head at all strengthens and locks. The imbalance creates a positive feedback loop. Weaker deep flexors mean less neutral position support, which means more forward drift, which means more suboccipital load, which means more compression, which means more fascial remodeling around the forward position. Deep cervical flexors are among the most neglected muscles in the body. No common exercise targets them, no daily activity loads them specifically, and their atrophy produces no visible change in appearance. A person can have strong shoulders, a strong upper back, and a visibly muscular neck while their deep cervical flexors are profoundly weak, because the visible neck muscles are the superficial ones that respond to forward head loading by hypertrophying, while the deep postural muscles that should be preventing the forward drift atrophy from disuse beneath them. The chin tuck, the small subtle retraction of the chin toward the throat, barely visible to an observer without tilting the head, is the only movement that specifically loads the deep cervical flexors. It is the exercise that addresses the muscular imbalance driving the feedback loop. But the chin tuck cannot achieve its full range until the fascial restriction is released. The shortened anterior fascia prevents the retraction the deep flexors are trying to produce. Evening, I attempted to hold a retracted chin position for 5 minutes, timing myself, concentrating on the position, actively engaging the deep cervical flexors I had read about. The fascia pulled my head forward before the second minute. 90 seconds against 30 years of tissue remodeling. The tissue was stronger than the intention. The postural correction you try and fail at is a mechanical contest between voluntary muscle contraction and the elastic recoil of structurally remodeled connective tissue, and the tissue wins because it operates continuously while the voluntary contraction operates only during conscious attention. Anyone with diagnosed cervical instability, rheumatoid arthritis with upper cervical involvement, post-surgical cervical fusion, recent whiplash or concussion, must consult a physician before applying compression to the cervical spine. The suboccipital release protocol is contraindicated in severe osteoporosis of the cervical vertebrae or any condition affecting the structural integrity of the atlas or axis vertebrae. Internal jugular vein shares the foramen with the vagus nerve, and the compression that degrades the nerve signal also impedes venous drainage from the brain. Blood arriving at the brain through the carotid and vertebral arteries must leave through the internal jugular veins. When the foramen is narrowed by suboccipital compression, the outflow resistance increases. Intracranial venous pressure rises subtly, not enough to produce clinical symptoms in most people, but enough to contribute to the morning headaches, the sensation of pressure behind the eyes after prolonged screen work, and the brain fog that clears after physical activity reopens the venous drainage through increased cardiac output and muscular pumping. The compression affects two systems through one passage: the nerve that regulates every organ below the skull and the vein that drains the organ above it. Dual compression creates a compound effect you experience as brain fog, the diffuse cognitive heaviness that settles after prolonged screen work, the sensation that thinking requires more effort than it should, the mental fatigue disproportionate to the intellectual demand, the